Howdy. My name is Robert Maddock. I am a professor in meat sciences in the animal sciences department at NDSU. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about utilizing value cuts, especially related to beef, and finding some great eating experiences with some lower cost cuts of meat. I think a very timely topic with the inflation we've had and the run up in meat prices, and especially beef prices. And it'll take a few minutes just to talk about that. Over the next just a little bit, I'm going to talk a lot about factors that affect eating experiences, cut selection, and meat cookery. It's very possible to have a really high quality eating experience from just about any cut of meat or beef. Doesn't matter how expensive it is if you just do a few things that make sense, handle meat right, select it right, and cook it right. And I'm going to get into some of the science and the technical aspects of how you can do these selections, and they should help you out as you go through and figure out what you might want to use for just about any setting when you're cooking meat or selecting meat for dinner for your family or a party or for yourself. So meat prices, here's some quotes that would come right off some analysts in Wall Street. Just shows that beef and veal prices over the last year are up 20%. You know, pork's up a lot, chicken's up quite a bit as well. But we can see that the beef prices have really taken off. Again, if you're a producer or rancher, as long as demand is staying steady, that's not a big deal. In fact, that's actually a nice thing that we can handle these higher beef prices. But as a consumer, it gets a little worrisome. That there's just an awful lot of a price increase in beef. And, from a producer standpoint, especially a beef producer standpoint, well, people start turning to alternative proteins, especially chicken or vegetable proteins. Um, but as we can see, there's that big run up in beef prices. I'm going to show you a little bit more of that too. So hopefully you can read all this, but it just shows going back a couple of years now, some various prices for different beef items. And you can see November 19. So, I think we had probably had COVID back then. Ground beef was 380, chuck roasts were 540 on average. And these are USDA numbers for national averages. Round roast $5, and then like sirloin steaks were 8, stew meat was 5 something, and then just all steaks. And if you look at the run up over those 2 years, I mean everything's up a buck, $2, $3 a pound. And if you the increase in the bottom, we're at, that's that 20, 30, 40% increase in some of these cuts. Sirloin steaks were 8.30, now they're $11.50 in November of 21. Um, so what are we gonna do, right? Are you gonna, if you really want to eat the steak, you really want to eat meat, I guess you'll pay the higher prices. And to this point, people have accepted some of those higher prices. But from a meal planning standpoint, from if you got a big party or you have a large family, that may not be possible. So, what should we do with that? I think it's important to answer that question on why do people eat meat and beef in particular. Uh, Normally, if we were at an audience, I'd stop, we'd take some questions here until people got it right. But let me tell you why people eat beef. Okay. Um, Beef protein, and one of the answers people say that they eat beef because of the good protein source. It's a good food source. If we just take beef protein, current price around $1.35 for live cattle. That's a little bit old, but it's pretty close. So it's $1.30 pound for a live steer, for example. Okay. About 63% of a live animal becomes a carcass. It's called dressing percent. So if we divide out that price by 63%, we see that carcass price is around $2.14 a pound for the carcass. But we can't eat the whole carcass either. There's lots of bones, there's fat, there's some other things is there that'll get dropped off. So about 62% of the carcass is actually meat that we will consume. So then we can see that boneless beef price is about 3.45 a pound. This is the actual price. It kind of explains why beef has kind of gotten expensive. Is just getting to this point, we're at 3.45 a pound. Meat's about 20% protein, and beef is there as well. So if we divide that out by 20%, we see that beef protein costs about $17.28 a pound. Now, the easiest thing to substitute, or the lowest substitute for beef protein or meat protein, is probably soy protein. Not as good, it's not as complete. There's some other issues. I think as a meat scientist and a beef cattle producer, beef protein is certainly better. But if it just comes to selling protein and cost, local price for soy is about 12.30 a bushel, depending on where you're at in the state or the country. That's a pretty good price. About 60 pounds test weight, so 60 pounds per bushel for soybeans means that soybeans cost about 20 cents per pound. right? And they're about 39% protein. And so we see that for a pound of soy protein is 53 cents. So if it was just about consuming protein, we'd be eating soy. So we see that beef protein is 30 times more expensive than soy protein. Why do people eat beef? Because it tastes good. And if it doesn't taste good, there's really people would stop eating. So we got to make sure that we're going to make any beef or any meat we eat taste good. So, how can you ensure that you are having beef that for yourself, for your family, for your guests is going to taste good? Well, here's what you can do. Have a good eye at the market. And I'm going to go through some of those quality things you can look for when you go to the supermarket, to the grocery store, to your local meat shop as well. You can buy the whole animal. Your local producers, ranchers. There's a lot of people selling freezer beef, locker beef. Um, Generally, that's a good thing. We get some higher quality things out of there, and I'll explain why that is in a little bit as well. And then buy some lower price cuts and make them taste great. Lower prices are great, and we have the ability. A good cook can do this, right? They can make a lower price cut and make them taste great. So, getting into this a little bit, what are some factors affecting beef eating experiences? So, we want to select high quality beef. If you have a chance to buy steaks, roasts, whatever, you're always looking for high quality beef. I give a talk in another program, the barbecue boot camp program that we do out of NDSU Animal Sciences, and I give a talk on meat selection and cookery. And I always say there's 4 C's of meat selection, and then I have to make up a word to make it work. But cut, quality, cookery, and consumption. And I'm going to go through some of these as well. We'll get to cut here in a little bit, but I want to focus on quality here for just a few minutes. When we're buying meat at a grocery store or supermarket or even your local meat shop, we're looking for high quality meat. And when we're talking about high quality meat, the big things we're looking for is color, marbling, and purge. And I'll talk about those in a little bit, but I'm going to focus on color. We want high quality, bright red color of beef. And I got some pictures here in a little bit as well. Um, there's, uh, and a fair amount of marbling. A marbling is intramuscular fat. Folks, the Warren fat's over. Beef fat, for the most part, is actually good for your health. So don't be scared of having some fat in your meat in your diet. Um, and the other quality thing is purge. So if you pick up a package of meat, it's got that saran overwrap in a tray. If there's some water in there, and that's not blood. If there's some moisture in that package, it's actually water that's colored by the meat pigment myoglobin. If it's full of water, what that is juiciness you haven't had that is gone before you get a chance to cook the product. So when you're going to select some meat for cooking, those quality things that we want to focus on is really bright, nice colors, especially for fresh meat. Um, no purge, a fair amount of marbling, or as much marbling as you can afford, uh, and then a good thickness, like an inch thick steak. Now, we're not going to spend. I'm going to get to cookery in a little bit as well, and go through some of the things that actually affect meat quality. Okay. So here's a study we did, or actually it's a kind of a meta study. We took a lot of different things, and here are some factors that affect beef palatability or how good beef tastes. You see, there's a bunch of them there. We went through and tried to figure out just about everything. The ones in red are the things that consumers can really control when they do selection or how they're going to cook. So cooking method, marbling, freezing of meat color, aging, blade tenderization, degree of doneness, muscle differences. And this is on a scale of relative importance. And you can see muscle differences, we'll get to there at the end, is super important. But all of these actually have some importance as we go through it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking. The cooking methods, there's basically 2 methods. There's hot and fast, and there's low and slow. And if you're using these 2 methods, the important thing, first consideration is the cut. If you're going to cook hot and fast, like on a grill or in your pan or a broiler pan in your oven that's going to be hot and you're going to cook it for 10, 12 minutes, the cut has to be tender to start with. And the reason for that is a lot of beef tenderness is due to the amount of connective tissue in it. And if you cook something hot and fast, that connective tissue won't break down. And so the meat has to be tender to start with. So, hot and fast at grilling, you need to have tender meats, ribeyes and tenderloins and strip steaks and sirloins, and then maybe a couple things like flat irons or maybe even an arm steak work for that. But if you throw a round steak on the grill, you cook it hot and fast or in a pan, it's probably not going to be very good unless you do something to it. Versus low and slow. Here's where we can do some crock pot cooking. We can put things in oven, Swiss steaks, stew meat, those sorts of things. And what that does is there's moisture with the meat, And those low and slow cooking times, however, it could be hours. Sometimes we cook meat in the meat lab for close to 24 hours, breaks down that connective tissue and allows the meat to become very tender. Um, it also gives opportunity to add some different flavors as well, make some gravies, for example. But that's their two methods. So if you've got tender meat to start with, you can basically do whatever you want. But of course, that's the expensive meat. So it's this low and slow cooking, a little bit of time, whether it's a crock pot, an oven, or something like that, or a smoker, where you have to spend some time, breaks down those connective tissues and allows meat to get tender. Okay. Marbling is the next one for selection. That's one of those quality things we talked about. Marbling is the amount of fat inside the muscle. So that's not the external fat, the fat that's actually in the meat. More is generally better when it comes to flavor and tenderness. Um, there is a minimum there, and a lot of people find that once you've got enough marbling, more sometimes is good. But marbling actually provides you is insurance. You could be the world's worst cook of meat, and if you had a prime tenderloin, there's no way you can make it tough. There's literally nothing you can do. Versus the best cooks in the world they couldn't take a select round steak, throw it on a grill, and make it taste very good. It's going to be tough and dry no matter what. But if you're in a meat shop or your grocery store and you're generally looking for more marbling is always better. But again, there's more expense that goes into it. So you can buy those lower marbling cuts, and we see that the lowest one that would typically be available is select, but you do want to buy graded meat. Okay, so our grades are select, choice, and prime. Select, if you see ungraded meat, you may want to avoid that sometimes, depending on some other factors you can look at. Generally, ungraded meat has some other problem. It was too dark, or it had an issue, or it's coming from older animals. But again, uh, what marbling provides you is insurance. If you're a bad cook, you can pay some more money and get some higher marbled meat. But if you're not, it's possible to take lower marbled meat and do very good things with it if you cook it properly. Okay. Following that chart down, freezing. Now, freezing is one of those things that people may be a little, they think, oh, the meat comes frozen, it's not as high quality. What we know for a fact is that frozen meat is more tender than meat that's never been frozen. And a lot of people will say, well, I get meat from my neighbor, from the locker, whatever, I buy a quarter, half, and it's always better than I get out of the grocery store. Part of that is because that meat's been hard frozen for a while. And so freezing is actually a good thing. I don't necessarily recommend going into the grocery store buying steaks, putting them in a bag and freezing them because you have some other things that can happen like freezer burn. Um, they could dry out as well or have some other problems, pick up some off flavors in the freezer. But buying frozen meat, again from a local locker or a producer, generally gets higher quality because the freezing does some things that actually improves tenderness. Meat color, super important. Has to do with basically the state of the animal, how it was handled at slaughter. There's some pictures here just showing some bright colors and some dark colors. Um, and it also shows the color differences as meat comes out of a vacuum package. Okay. And what we're looking for, especially in a retail case where there's that saran overwrap, is that bright. So it's the top right picture we got there. Bright red colors. That's normal pH meat. Don't worry much about pH. It has to do with the again, how the animal's handled and maybe some genetic things. But that's normal pH and bright color. That's what we're shooting for. If you see these dark colors, off colors, things that are a little muddy, we know for a fact that those tend to be tougher and drier and have some more off flavors than that bright red meat. So if you're selecting beef, go for the brightest, reddest color you can. Now, as a side note, I know we're not talking about pork much today. If you're buying pork chops, go for the darkest pork chop you can find, not the palest. The darkest one is going to provide a lot better eating experience. Next thing we talk about then is aging. Aging is great. Aging is holding meat in an unfrozen state to improve its tenderness. Here's just an example of an aging curve all the way from day 0 out to day 35. And the longer you hold meat in an unfrozen state, the more tender it gets. Of course, this is best done at a processing plant, uh, either in a vacuum package bag, which is called wet aging, or you can age whole cuts or whole carcasses is called dry aging. They do provide some different flavors, but the same improvement in tenderness. So if you have the opportunity, if you're buying some locker beef or something like that, if it's aged, 7 to 10 days is about the minimum we'd recommend, especially if it's going to be frozen. 14 days is good, but that's a long time for a packing plant or even a meat processor to hold onto a carcass for you. Uh, Again, I don't necessarily advocate going to a grocery store, buying some meat and holding it unfrozen in your fridge for a while. It will become more tender. Doesn't matter if it's in the cut or the carcass. Uh, but again, some other problems that come in, you could get some funky flavors or some other things if you try and do that. Now, if you have a vacuum packager and you wanted to buy, for example, the local grocery store had a ribeye roll special, and you wanted to buy and cut some rib steaks for summer, and you had a little vacuum packager at home, you could vacuum package those steaks, hold them for a few days unfrozen, and throw them in the freezer, and they'd actually improve tenderness. But I'm not sure that you'd be able to see a big enough difference to make it worth your time. Blade tenderization. Here's one of the things we can do for cookery with those tough cuts. And I just got here is that meat hammer. We beat the heck out of it. And what we're doing with blade tenderization, there's two ways. There's this kind of blunt hammer style, and then there's the knives, like a jacquard is the retail or the company name of the knife needle tenderization little handheld thing. What we're doing is we're cutting up that connective tissue, especially in tough cuts. And so we do some blade tenderization. So if you take a round steak and you beat the heck out of it, or you run that blade tenderizer through it, what we've done is we've made it more tender because that connective tissue has been disrupted. Um, would advocate this for lots of things, especially if you're going to cook. So if you beat up a steak like this, you run through a blade tenderizer. You can probably do a chicken fried out of it. You can do a minute steak, things like that, and make it taste pretty good because it's been tenderized. But it's one of those things you really need to do with lower cost cuts and tougher meat to make it good. Degree of doneness. I can't overemphasize this, how important this is, and we've got it for steaks. Now, if we're going to do that tenderization, you need to cook those steaks till they're done, because there's potential to introduce some bacteria into the middle of them. So typically, if you're going to cook those, you probably need to go to 150 degrees at least for a little while. So somewhere in medium well. But if you've done that, uh, tenderize them enough that that's not a big deal. But if you're cooking other things, getting the degree of doneness you're shooting for is pretty important. And we always tell people use a meat thermometer to do this. You can't, you're not good enough unless you're a professional chef to just touch the meat and determine if it's rare or medium rare. The other thing about degree of doneness is, especially if you're cooking in a hot oven or a hot grill, the laws of physics talk about heat transfer. So we get heat and mass transfers. What's going on is the outside of that steak or roast is the temperature basically once it's dried off of the grill or the oven. Now, that heat will continue into the center. So a lot of people think, oh, I'd like to have a medium rare steak, so I want to pull it at 130 degrees Fahrenheit. But once you pull it out of the oven or off the grill, that temperature can go up 10, 15, 20 degrees, and suddenly your medium rare steak is medium to medium well. So people think they're eating medium rare, but they're eating medium or medium well, and they say, well, I get a better steak at the steakhouse. And part of that is the steakhouse is giving you a true medium rare, where if you're trying it at home, you're probably not. So we always tell people if you're going to cook to like medium rare, I always say pull those steaks off the hot grill or out about hot oven at 120 to 125 degrees. Let it come up to 130, and it will over time. But degree of doneness is pretty important. You can see how it was related. It's one of the bigger factors that affect that. Uh, medium rare will be more tender and juicy. Then as you get into medium well to well, meat's going to be tougher and drier. Muscle differences. Here's one of those big things, and this is where it's interesting. If you plot tenderness versus price, it's almost directly correlated with a couple differences here. But cuts vary widely in tenderness. Tenderloin steaks less than 5 pounds shear. There's a tenderloin steak there. You could tear this apart with your fingers for the most part. Ribeyes are about 6 pounds, top sirloins 8, things like that. Uh, so you can see there's a big jump up there. So you get into arm steaks and those round steaks. So the most part, if you're gonna do those round steaks, you got to do some things. Like I said, you got to tenderize them. You got to cook them low and slow, like in a crock pot. You got to, if you're gonna try and do a roast with them, you can cut them. You can cook them to medium rare and then slice them thin. Is another way to use a round roast, for example. And then we see brisket at the bottom. Brisket's actually pretty expensive. It's typically the toughest cut in the entire beef carcass, but it's fairly expensive. And so we know about cooking low and slow, right? So briskets, got to cook them low. We got to barbecue them 8, 10, 12, 15 hours to break down all that connective tissue to make them tender enough to actually eat. So how do you handle these lower cost cuts? You're going to value shop there. Don't scrimp on quality. look for those bright colors, right? The amount of marbling you want. Make sure there's no purge, and that if you're going to cook a steak out of them, if you're going to beat them up, make sure they have the thickness you want, so you get your degree of doneness. Um, don't throw on the grill. Uh, as a steak, these lower value cuts without doing something. You're gonna have to tenderize it. You're gonna have to do something to that steak if you just want to grill it as a steak. The other thing, a lot of those cuts are lower fat. They don't have as much marbling, so they're not going to be as tender and juicy. So don't just grill your round steaks. You got to do some with them. Again, Swiss steak, chicken fried, you beat up. Uh, those, put it in the oven for 2.5, 3, 4 hours with some mushroom gravy. But beware of those differences in cut. A steak is not just a steak as you go through these things. So, again, if we had an audience, I'd say, how would you cook a boneless arm roast? And the see on sale. This is the ad in Devil's Lake for January 3rd. You see, we got boneless arm roast for $4.99 a pound. Boneless arm roast, actually a fairly good cut, makes a really great roast. How would you cook it? Well, there's a couple ways you could go. We cook a lot of them at the NDSU meat slabs for 24 hours at about 167, 170 degrees, and then slice them, right? Another way would be to cook them to medium rare, uh, slice them thin. They'll be really good. So there's lots of ways to go with that. And then we see stew meat. Now, if I were you and I saw this ad, I would buy that boneless arm roast and cut it into stew meat and save $1 a pound. This is going to be very high quality stew meat. But there's some of those things you have to keep up with as you go through and as you do some value shopping. Some knife work done in the back there for stew meat. Uh, it's probably worth $1 a pound to some people, but it's a lot easier to buy a roast like that, especially like an arm roast, and turn it into stew meat. Um, so I hope you find some of this instructive as what we talked about. There's my contact information. We're always happy to help. Send me an email, give me a call anytime, and we'll be walk you through any sort of cooking, explain the slides, help you figure out cuts. Um, we're always there to help.